Hello everybody and welcome to Constitutional Law. My name is Andrew Sartorius and I hope you all had a great Christmas break. Welcome to the course. Let's jump right in with going over how you should expect courses to look. I use an app called Obsidian, so I'm going to publish all of my course notes for you all to read through. Also, it's what I'm going to be presenting from, so everything is going to look somewhat uniform. Every class is going to start with every week is going to start with kind of an overview of what we're going to be looking at. This week we don't have any preparation because this is the first class. I didn't expect you all to read everything to begin with. But after this class, we're going to jump it right in with a reading assignment. I'm going to have you read Rodriguez versus the United States. That case is linked right here. And then as you can see, we have the homework lined out. After completing this class and watching the video, you should post an introduction of yourself in the corresponding forum page within Canvas, and then write a case brief for the assigned case. As this is the beginning of class for this semester, here are the learning objectives for today. We are going to talk about the different types of courts, the history of the United States Constitution and Articles of Confederation, how to read a case, more importantly for me, how to brief a case, and additionally, students are going to be able to use OneNote class notebooks to turn in your case briefs, and so that you have a reference of all of those, become familiar with the format and expectations of this class, and finally, you'll review the syllabus which is posted. This next section, which you guys are going to be able to see when you log into this on your web browsers, is going to be the video for the class, which I'm going to host through YouTube. About this course, first off about me. I'm Andrew Sartorius. I'm a trial attorney. Now I'm the interim director of continuing legal education for the Missouri Bar. That means I make the classes that lawyers need to keep being lawyers. I'm on the production side of things, so I work a lot with volunteer speakers and putting together conferences and stuff like that. I'm married. I have 2 kids. I'll show you guys a picture of them at some point, I'm sure. They tend to work their way into my explanations of different things often. I have a condition called albinism, awesome white hair, terrible vision. This probably isn't going to matter so much for an online class, but where it might come into play is that if you are turning anything in, please make sure it's legible. I'm going to have a hard time reading things that, are too small. The general expectations of this class is that we're going to, you can see the complete overview, which we'll look at in a minute, of all of the different days in the calendar and the syllabus information here. That's linked within the notes. I'll also have it on Canvas for you all. Basically, you're going to have to turn in case briefs, which you're going to submit these through the OneNote class notebook, which we'll look at in a minute. You're going to reach out if you have any issues with this, because this is not a super simple process to either brief a case or to turn it in this way. But I'm always at your disposal, so please just give me a call, shoot me an email, a message through Canvas, whatever works for you. We're also going to do discussions. So if you have any questions about anything that we're covering, you're going to send them to me. But in addition to that, when we do these different cases, I will post some questions for you guys to answer, and then I want you all to also post some questions that you want to go through too. We'll talk about that general requirement when we get to the syllabus in just a second. Finally, we're going to have some optional Zoom meetings. I'm going to send out a survey in the next week or two asking when people can meet. And if you guys ever want to meet to talk about something in person, have a question and answer, I will record those, post those recordings on Zoom, make them available for everybody. But the point here is that I want to make sure that we are as collaborative as possible in this process. Just because it's online doesn't mean that you can't have the full normal class experience, just on your own time, kind of. And finally, we'll go over the boilerplate when we get to the actual syllabus in a second. I'm going to skip over the lines, this section for a second, and we'll talk about how to use OneNote in a minute. This is in your notes to tell you, hey, watch this video. That's where we're going to go over it. Well, actually, let's just do that aspect now. So on your screen now, you should see OneNote. And if you haven't used this before, it is a very powerful note-taking application. I have it set up as a course notebook. This is pretty cool because it allows me to have a place for my notes. You're going to see I have my case brief written for Rodriguez versus United States already in here. If you're really smart, you could probably copy that, but you shouldn't. It's going to defeat the purpose of the exercise. We have this area where it has collaboration. This is where I can share different documents that you all can use as a library. This area where it talks about the different library elements here. So in collaboration, you all can work on things together, but in the catalog, in the content library, you're able to basically just see things that I post. My teachers only section is there, but then each of you has your own individual notebook as well. Using Jada as an example, you can see I've already broken your course notebooks down into case briefs, final projects, and notes. You can take notes in the notes section all you'd like. Final projects, please keep track of what you're working on. We'll talk more about the final project next week, but in the final project section, especially if we do a lot of teamwork and I have to give people individual scores, this is going to show me what you've been working on versus what your fellow classmates are. Case briefs, this is going to be the most important section early on. You are going to create a case brief for every case that we read in class. This is different from normal. Normally I would have you guys brief one or two so you know what you're doing, but as it's an online class, I really want to be respectful of your time, and while I expect you to read, I don't really want to have you do like 10 or 15 comments a week. I really want to kind of keep that interaction component to a minimum. Because of that, I need to make sure you're reading somehow. The way we're going to do that is by doing case briefs. So if we read a case, let's say just like Jones versus Arizona, you're going to put the title there, and then you're going to write out your brief in this section. We'll cover what all needs to go into your brief later on, and I'm going to delete that title so that Jada doesn't have to deal with that later. That's it. You save it. You make sure it syncs. If you do Control S, it should sync. Additionally, if you hit Control S or Command S if you're on a Mac, it'll automatically sync. Additionally, you could go to File and then sync this notebook, and it will save it. Once it's synced, I will be able to go through and see what you have done on your notebook and give you credit, more importantly, for the things that you have done. Please make sure you're doing this on time. We'll talk about the time expectations in a bit, but effectively, I don't really tolerate late work, so it would be better if you turn that in early, or at least on time. So this seems a little juvenile, but I do want to cover it, and that's to review the courts, because there's a lot of stuff that seems boilerplate or seems almost like granted, but we all need to be on the same page with it. So to start, we have civil versus criminal courts. In civil courts, this is where a person sues another person. Notably, the definition of who a person is going to be extremely broad, right? When we talk about who a person is, that could be a person, that could be an entity, that could be a business. Sometimes people can even be the government. It really just depends on what context we're talking about. Typically, when we have civil cases, we are going to have money damages. It's going to be financial in nature rather than in a criminal case, which we'll talk about in a second, where it's going to be a loss of liberty or rights. Criminal cases, this always happens where the government sues somebody else. So when we have a criminal case, it's always going to be the state of Missouri versus, or the United States versus. It's the first indicator that it's criminal versus a civil case. Typically, the term of person is much more literally construed here. When we're talking about a person with a criminal case, we're usually talking about an individual person or people. It is true for those of you that are like, wait a minute, Andrew, that doesn't make sense to me. I've heard of companies getting criminal charges. That is true. A company can receive criminal charges in certain circumstances. That's not very common. And if it does happen, then what we're talking about still is the officers or owners of that company being held responsible. You can't take a company and put it in jail. You can take the owners or officers of a company and put them in jail. The typical outcome of this, if convicted, is some sort of loss of liberty. That means we're going to put you in jail. We're going to take your property away. You're going to have a criminal record that's going to have some sort of stigma associated with it. It's usually a lot less forgiving than a civil case. So that's the first thing. We need to understand that there's a difference between civil and criminal courts. It's foundational. We'll deal with that a lot more as the semester goes on, because we always kind of want to understand what arena we're playing in when we start talking about constitutional law. The second foundational thing I need you guys to be thinking about is that there are 3 levels of courts. These are going to be trial courts. This is where the case is actually tried. In Missouri, these are referred to as your circuit courts or your district courts federally. Other states have different names for these courts. In New York, for example, I believe it's Superior Court. In effect, it doesn't really matter as long as you understand that we have a trial court. For our purposes, I will be primarily talking about federal cases, because while some of our state cases are going to follow what the federal government decides, we are primarily going to be looking at where constitutional law is made, and constitutional law is typically made in federal court. At trial courts, they hear evidence, and that should be H-E-A-R. I will change that. I apologize. They hear evidence and rule on the merits of the case. They are the finder of fact and concluders of law. This is different from appellate courts, as we'll see in a minute, but basically what they're doing is actually deciding who's right, who's wrong, and why. Now, let's just skip ahead. It's going to be a lot more clear when we get to appellate courts. This is where the conclusions of a trial court are reviewed. The names are flipped from what I just told you, because if you remember, circuit court is the trial court in Missouri, district court is the trial court in the federal system, vice versa. In Missouri, the district court is going to be our courts of appeal. That's the Eastern, Western, and Southern District. In the United States system, it's going to be circuit court. We here in Missouri fall into the 18th Circuit, but yeah, just different names for the same thing. It is the Court of Appeals. They rule on the legality of the conclusions a trial judge makes, but they don't actually produce evidence. When I say that, I mean that if we are on appeal, we are going to say, did the judge get it right or wrong? We're not actually going to be able to say, did this person tell the truth or not? Somebody could come out and say, I'm lying. I didn't tell the truth when we were at trial. We should redo this. And the remedy for that is going to be to go back to the trial court and do something there, not to actually bring up that factual issue in the Court of Appeals. The Court of Appeals deals with the record. What's on the record is what's on the record. They don't actually produce their own record, at least not from the standpoint of taking evidence. The Supreme Court is kind of wonky. This is where the conclusions of the courts of appeal are reviewed, sort of. Both in Missouri and in the United States, we call it the Supreme Court. You should know that. Did I put this in here? No, I didn't. I will often abbreviate the Supreme Court of the United States as SCOTUS. I will say that. You will hear it frequently. SCOTUS is Supreme Court of the United States. That acronym is somewhere in my notes. You'll see them. You'll see it referenced. I don't know where, but you should know if I say SCOTUS, I'm talking about the United States Supreme Court. They are the final arbiter of law. Similar to courts of appeal, they don't actually make a record, they don't take evidence, but they review what has been done before. In Missouri, our Supreme Court is going to, when they accept a case, they vacate and set aside the Court of Appeals decision. This means it no longer exists. The Supreme Court sits in place of the Court of Appeals. The federal system's a little bit different. The Supreme Court does not actually operate in a vacuum, but they don't really confine themselves to what the Court of Appeals did. They can go beyond what the Court of Appeals did if they want to. The reason this is important is because many times the reason SCOTUS takes a case is to refer to disagreements among the various circuits. Let's say the 18th Circuit rules one way, the 11th Circuit rules another way. The Supreme Court will often accept certiorari, that is, they will accept a case to determine if one of the circuits should win. And then finally, as I said before, we are primarily going to be concerned with Supreme Court of the United States cases, that's SCOTUS. There is the topic of constitutional law is frankly so broad that you could get advanced degrees just in studying constitutional law. My goal here is to give you an appetizer of what constitutional law is, an introduction. And if you're interested in law school or pursuing your studies elsewhere, give you a foundation from which you can build on, both in terms of practical skills and knowledge, so that you can take what you've learned here and apply it to something else. I don't have enough time, nor do you, frankly, to do the deep dive into constitutional law that would be required if you want to actually be a scholar in this field. And a lot of that scholarship is going to take place when you start looking at what the different circuits are doing with things. Therefore, we're going to focus mostly on the Supreme Court. Briefing a case. This is very important. This is one of the primary skills you're going to use in this class. And again, if you want to continue your studies in constitutional law or become a lawyer, briefing a case is absolutely essential. The purpose of briefing a case is that we're going to develop something that you can refer back to. So instead of every single time I say, give me the facts of Rodriguez versus the United States, you can actually pick up your case brief and say, I've got this, without having to reread the thing every single time. It's just a cheat sheet, something for you to refer back to. For this reason, everybody's brief is going to be just a little bit different. This is going to focus on the things you need to give you the working knowledge of the case. What I write is going to be very different than what you're going to write, and what you're going to write is going to be very different from each of your other classmates too. With case briefs, there's typically no right or wrong. However, in the beginning, I'm going to have to focus on whether or not you're capturing the core aspects of the case. As you're learning how to do this, I'm going to be a little bit more critical to make sure you're picking up on the core concepts here, which we'll talk about in just a second. I'm not saying that this is how you have to brief your case in the future, but I do want to make sure you're pulling out the right information from the case so that you have the tools you need if you need to refer back to it. So, parts of a case brief. You should always have a factual background. This is basically going to be what happened. How did the case get to where we are? What are the facts we need to be able to understand what happened? If I tell you the issue of a case is, should we be able to have a traffic stop when somebody crosses the middle line for a very brief moment, you don't really know what we're applying that rule to when we get down to it. So you need to give yourself a little bit of background so you understand what you're talking about and why it's important. The issue is what the court is actually deciding. I like to think about this as the question the court is asking. In Rodriguez, you're going to find out that the issue is, can a traffic stop be prolonged for a canine sniff? You want to distill this down to one sentence or so that you can say, here's what we're actually looking at. That way, when you go back to it, you can easily point out, yeah, here's what we're dealing with. The rule is going to be the applicable case law, statute, regulation, or constitutional provision that's being addressed. Lots of times there's going to be more than one rule, or you're going to want to be very specific with the rule you're using because you get down into subparts of the rule, or with the Fourth Amendment, we're dealing with an exception to the warrant requirement. So the rule should be somewhat precise. You shouldn't just say Fourth Amendment. You should say something like, in the case of Rodriguez, some words around the purpose of the reasonableness of a search. Application is going to be your biggest section. I should have highlighted this as well, but this is going to be how the rule is applied to the facts. Once you have defined the rule, you are going to apply that rule to the facts to get your conclusion, or to answer the question. The conclusion is going to be responsive to the issue, but it's also going to be the product of your rule plus facts. This is the result of the application of the rule to the facts. Finally, I always like to do a follow-up. This is not strictly necessary. If you don't do one, I'm not going to be angry with you, but if you end up doing this in the real world, it's kind of important, because including the subsequent case history is pretty important. It's embarrassing to stand in front of a judge and cite a case when that case has either been overturned, or it's been superseded by some other case, or the law has changed. And even also is embarrassing, as we'll talk about with Rodriguez in the next class, is that while the case you're looking at may actually support your premise, later on that individual may have lost terribly. Like I said, we'll talk about that with Rodriguez afterwards. But in effect, in his case, while he won his motion to suppress after going to the Supreme Court, the Court of Appeals was basically like, yeah, but the cop acted in good faith, so who cares? It's embarrassing to stand in front of a judge and say, Judge, you have to do X because of Y, only for the judge to say yes, but in that situation, it didn't happen. So having that information in a case brief is beneficial. For our purposes, not so much, but if you want to do it, it's just even better. To work on this, you have homework. You'll be reading a case. It's referenced above. There's a hyperlink for you. And you are going to brief it. So you're going to write that case brief. You're going to put it in OneNote, and I'm going to read it from there. I'm going to be very forgiving with this first one. I'm going to give you lots of feedback, but the point is for you to practice reading a case and for you to get familiar with this format that I'm asking you to do. This is for you to refer to as you are working through constitutional issues. That said, this case, while it deals with the Fourth Amendment and is therefore quasi-constitutional, it's not super relevant to what our discussions are going to be about over the course of the semester, at least not until we get deep into the amendments. But it's a good place to start because the opinion's pretty short and it's kind of an interesting case. Here's a big thing. Unless I specifically tell you otherwise, I only need you to read the majority opinion. Cases typically are going to have a majority opinion and maybe some concurring opinions or dissenting opinions. We'll talk about what all that means later, don't worry about it. But unless I tell you otherwise, just read that first opinion. Just read the majority. You may, of course, read, don't be like, Andrew said not to ever read these. No, you may, of course, read the other opinions, and in practice you should. When you're further along in your studies, this is going to be important to understand the way the judges are thinking about things, or why there might be areas to challenge laws that there have been Supreme Court precedences on in the past. But for now, unless I tell you otherwise, only read that majority opinion. I want to be cognizant of your time. Reviewing the Constitution. At this point in your studies, all of you should have covered the Constitution at some point. This is a senior level political science class, so I expect that you are pretty familiar with what the United States Constitution says, but I have a video review to talk about why our Constitution came to be, what kind of differences it has. It's real short and sweet, maybe 13 minutes. Please watch this video before you move on to most other things. And please actually go through and reread the Constitution. It's only 2 pages. There's lots of people who think they know what the Constitution says, but take the time, read the 2 pages. It's going to help you as we start working through this stuff soon. Finally, next class, I want to see where all of you are with briefing cases. So before I post what we're going to work on next, I don't want you working ahead until I've gotten a chance to see everybody's case briefs. By Friday, I expect you all to be seeing this on Tuesday. So by Friday, I expect everybody to have read Rodriguez versus the United States and briefed it. This is going to be an easy week. It's a short week. My other classes are Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So my thought process is that I'm going to try and generate content Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So I think as in terms of Wednesday being your first day to start working on things, if you get it done Tuesday, oh well, that's great. But you must get it in by end of business on Friday. End of business means about 5 o'clock. So get it in by end of business on Friday so I can see where everybody's at, and we'll go ahead and generate that next class. So that said, let's switch over to the overview and go over some of the things that are in here. Let me make sure you all can see that right. And I'm going to just do that so you can see it better. I am going to always post at this top section, Constitutional Law Course Overview, what we do and going from there. So if there are any notes or if I want to try and put the reading in there, I'll put it there. I would encourage you just to go to the... what I actually post for each class, because that'll always have this big head section that does the preparation, reading assignment, homework, learning objectives, and so forth that we're going to be covering for the day. Under that, there is no textbook. I will be assigning all the cases for you to read. The best way to learn constitutional law is to work with primary sources. So because of that, there is no textbook. Grading participation or working on those discussion board is going to be a quarter of your grade. Your case briefs is going to be a quarter of your grade. We'll do a final project, which is going to be a quarter of your grade. And at least a final exam, probably a midterm, and that'll be a quarter of your grade too. I talked about the workflow, basically how you should be thinking about approaching this. I'm going to release at least weekly videos, but one way or another, you're going to have a module per week. And that's going to have the cases to read. And what I expect you to do is to read the cases, write your case review, and then there are 2 paths forward. You can either participate in the discussion board after reading your cases, but it might be helpful, and so I'm going to encourage you to watch my lesson before you go into the discussion. So this flowchart has 2 paths. This path says go ahead and watch the lesson before you go into the discussions. But if you want to skip that, you do have to watch the lesson at some point, but you can write your discussion beforehand. Not a big deal. When we're talking about discussions, my expectations are that you are writing one original thought and commenting on... sorry about that. I did say I've got 2 kids, so from time to time, you're going to hear interruptions like that. So when it comes to writing your posts, you're going to do at least 1 original post and then comment on 2 of your classmates' posts, or write 2 more original posts. If you want to write 3 original posts, okay with me. If you want to write an original post and 2 derivative posts, that's also fine. Policy, this is all boilerplate, and to the extent necessary, we're going to conform with university policies. But late work, I don't accept late work. If you have something big happen, if there's a death in the family, if you're in the hospital, I understand these things happen, and because of that, I will work with you. I reserve the right to make exceptions to this policy in extraordinary circumstances where there's actually documentation. If you don't get me documentation, if you just say, sure, I'm not going to turn this in today, not much I can do to help you. Attendance doesn't apply to this class, but I put it in here anyway. Lincoln University has an attendance policy. They, since I've been here, haven't really enforced it, but if they do, I do want you to know about it. And it's basically if you miss 6 classes or more, you automatically get failed from the class. Academic integrity, don't cheat. Even with new AI technologies and everything, even with new augmented technology realities and everything, there are ways that I can figure out that you're cheating, and I will, to the extent possible, try and ask questions to basically not permit things like that to work. If you get caught cheating, I reserve the right to give you a 0 for the question or assignment. That means that if you answer one of 50 questions on an exam dishonestly, and I'm not saying I'll have 50 questions, but I just want to illustrate the point. If you answer one of 50 questions dishonestly, I reserve the right in my discretion to give you a 0 for that question or for the entire exam. That's going to be huge. I am surprised that Lincoln University doesn't have a global academic integrity policy, but a lot of universities do. And so I really want you all to get in the habit of not using work without citing it, not cheating, because if you get caught at other institutions, it could be automatic expulsion. I don't mean to be a jerk here, but I really want to see what you guys can do, not what the computer can do. Title IX, if you believe that you've been discriminated in any case, even though Title IX applies to discrimination based on gender, please go to the Title IX office. They'll be able to help. Americans with Disabilities Act, if you are a person who requires assistance because you have a disability, I don't get to make that call. That has to go through the Access Office. They're the ones who are going to say what is and what is not a reasonable accommodation. And when they do that, I'm then going to basically be given notice of, hey, we made this determination. Please honor this request. So thank you all so much. On Canvas, my contact information is going to be posted for you to get through, but since this is a public-facing thing, I'm not going to put it in the YouTube video or on my website. If you have any questions or concerns, please give me a call, shoot me a text, whatever works for me. I really look forward to working with you all this semester, and I hope it's a good one. Thank you very much in advance.